October 15, 1946, Nuremberg, Germany. In a prison cell, just hours before his scheduled execution, Hermann Göring, once the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany, commander of the Luftwaffe, and Adolf Hitler's designated successor, bites down on a cyanide capsule hidden in his cell. He dies at 10:44 p.m., cheating the hangman's noose and denying the Allies their final moment of justice. But here's what most people don't know. When Göring died, he left behind a wife and a daughter, a 9-year-old girl named Edda, who had been named after Benito Mussolini's daughter, a wife, Emmy, who had been Germany's first lady of the Luftwaffe, dripping in jewels stolen from murdered Jews, a family that had lived in obscene luxury while millions died in concentration camps. What happened to Hermann Göring's family after his death is a story of denial, delusion, and a daughter who spent her entire life defending the indefensible. This is the story of how the Göring family went from ruling an empire of blood and gold to living in poverty and shame. How a little girl who once played in castles filled with stolen art became an elderly woman who never stopped loving the father who helped orchestrate the Holocaust. How Emmy Göring, who wore confiscated jewelry and lived in mansions seized from Jewish families, spent decades claiming her husband was a misunderstood hero. Some Nazi families ran, some changed their names, some apologized. The Görings did none of these things. To understand what happened after, we need to understand who Hermann Göring was and the empire of corruption and murder he built. Hermann Wilhelm Göring was born on January 12, 1893, in Rosenheim, Bavaria. He was a World War I fighter ace, credited with 22 aerial victories, and commanded the famous Flying Circus Squadron after the Red Baron's death in 1918. He was a genuine war hero, charismatic, brave, and decorated with the Palme Merit, Germany's highest military honor. But after World War I, Göring became addicted to morphine following treatment for injuries sustained during Hitler's failed beer hall putsch on November 9, 1923. This addiction, combined with his natural grandiosity and greed, would shape the rest of his life and the Nazi regime he helped build. When Hitler became Chancellor on January 30, 1933, Göring was appointed to multiple powerful positions: Minister of the Interior for Prussia, Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, and later plenipotentiary of the Four-Year Plan, essentially economic dictator of Nazi Germany. By 1940, Hitler named him Reichsmarschall, a rank created specifically for Göring, making him the highest-ranking officer in the German military. Göring used his power to accumulate staggering wealth. He confiscated art collections from Jewish families, acquiring over 1,500 paintings worth tens of millions of dollars. He seized estates, businesses, and personal property. His primary residence, Karenhau, named after his first wife, who died in 1931, was a massive hunting lodge 65 kilometers north of Berlin, filled with stolen treasures. The estate had its own zoo, private lake, and staff of over 50 servants. But Göring's greatest crime wasn't theft, it was mass murder. On July 31, 1941, Göring signed the order commissioning Reinhard Heydrich to prepare the complete solution of the Jewish question in the German sphere of influence in Europe. This was the authorization for the final solution, the systematic genocide that would murder 6 million Jews. Göring's signature is on the document that set the Holocaust in motion. He was also instrumental in creating the concentration camp system, oversaw the Gestapo in its early years, and ordered the Luftwaffe bombing campaigns that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians across Europe. Now, let's talk about his family, the people who lived off the blood money and the stolen wealth. Göring's first wife, Karin von Kantzow, died of tuberculosis on October 17, 1931. He was devastated and built his estate Karenhau as a shrine to her memory. But by 1935, Göring had met Emmy Sonnemann, a German actress who would become his second wife and the mother of his only child. Emmy Sonnemann was born on March 24, 1893, in Hamburg. She was a moderately successful stage actress when she met Göring in 1932 at a Weimar theatre production. Göring was immediately smitten with the blonde, elegant actress who represented the cultured, sophisticated image he wanted to project. They married on April 10, 1935, in a lavish ceremony in Berlin, attended by Hitler himself. The wedding was a state affair with military parades, orchestras, and thousands of onlookers. Emmy became Germany's unofficial First Lady. Hitler was unmarried at the time, and she embraced the role with enthusiasm. For nearly 8 years, Emmy struggled to conceive. In the Nazi ideology that prized Aryan motherhood, this was a source of shame and frustration. But on June 2, 1938, at age 45, Emmy gave birth to a daughter at Carenhall. The baby was named Edda Göring. The name Edda was chosen to honor Edda Mussolini, the daughter of Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, reflecting the alliance between Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. Hitler himself was named godfather to the child, a symbolic gesture cementing Göring's position as Hitler's chosen successor. Edda Göring's birth was celebrated across Nazi Germany with parades, newspaper coverage, and public celebrations. She was showered with gifts from Nazi officials and foreign dignitaries. She grew up in unimaginable luxury, playing in Carenhall's vast gardens, surrounded by stolen art worth millions, dressed in the finest clothes, attended by servants. But this golden childhood, built on blood and theft, was about to come crashing down. By 1945, as Allied forces closed in on Germany from all sides, the Göring Empire was collapsing. The Luftwaffe, once Göring's pride, had been decimated. His morphine addiction had worsened. His relationship with Hitler had deteriorated after a series of military failures. On April 23, 1945, with Hitler trapped in his Berlin bunker, Göring sent a telegram asking if he should assume leadership of the Reich as Hitler's designated successor. Hitler, enraged by what he saw as treachery, stripped Göring of all ranks and ordered his arrest. Göring was placed under house arrest by the SS at his Bavarian home on April 25, 1945. When American forces arrived at Göring's residence on May 9, 1945, just one day after Germany's surrender, they found Hermann, Emmy, and 6-year-old Edda living in relative comfort, surrounded by suitcases packed with jewelry, artwork, and valuables that Göring hoped to use to negotiate with the Allies. What happened next would determine the fate of the Göring family for the next 80 years. The Nuremberg trials and a daughter's last goodbye. When American forces captured Hermann Göring on May 9, 1945, he initially believed he would be treated as a dignitary who could negotiate favorable terms. He was spectacularly wrong. Within days, Göring was transferred to Allied custody and began the journey to Nuremberg. Emmy and 6-year-old Edda were separated from him and placed in American custody, beginning their journey from privilege to poverty, from power to shame. The Americans immediately began investigating Emmy's role in the Nazi regime, her knowledge of her husband's crimes, and her own potential complicity in the looting and theft that had funded the Göring family's extravagant lifestyle. What they found was a woman who had lived in willful ignorance or calculated denial of the horrors that paid for her jewelry and mansions. Emmy was interrogated extensively between May and September 1945, and the transcripts, declassified decades later, reveal a woman who claimed to know nothing about concentration camps, nothing about the final solution, nothing about the systematic looting of Jewish property that directly funded her lifestyle. When confronted with evidence, photographs of Carenhall filled with stolen art, records of confiscated jewelry she wore, documentation of estates seized from murdered Jewish families, Emmy maintained that she believed everything had been legally acquired or were gifts to her husband for his service to Germany. But despite everything, despite the evidence of her husband's monstrous crimes emerging daily, Emmy Göring never wavered in her loyalty to Hermann. She visited him in prison whenever allowed, bringing young Edda, maintaining that he was a great man who had been misunderstood and betrayed. The Nuremberg trials officially began on November 20, 1945. Hermann Göring was the star defendant, the highest-ranking Nazi official to stand trial. He was charged with conspiracy to wage aggressive war, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The evidence was overwhelming. Throughout the 10-month trial, Emmy brought 7-year-old Edda to see her father whenever authorities permitted. These visits paint a disturbing picture of a family living in complete denial about the reality of Göring's crimes. What happened next reveals something profound about how families cope with unspeakable truth. They often choose comfortable lies over uncomfortable reality. During visits recorded by American guards, Emmy told Hermann she still believed he would be acquitted. Young Edda, only 7 years old, was too young to fully understand what was happening, but she understood that her father was in prison, that people said terrible things about him, and that her mother told her none of it was true. The psychological damage of this conflicting reality, the world saying your father is a monster, your mother saying he's a hero, would shape Edda Göring's entire life. On October 1st, 1946, after 218 trial days, the verdicts were announced. Hermann Göring was found guilty on all 4 counts and sentenced to death by hanging, scheduled for October 16, 1946. But on October 15, 1946, just hours before his scheduled execution, Göring managed to obtain a cyanide capsule. Historians still debate how he got it, with theories ranging from a sympathetic guard to it being hidden in his belongings all along, and at approximately 10:44 p.m., he bit down on it and died in his cell. The other convicted Nazi leaders were hanged as scheduled in the early morning hours of October 16, 1946. But Göring had escaped the noose, dying on his own terms, denying the Allies their final moment of justice. When Emmy and Edda learned of Hermann's death, Emmy reportedly said, "At least he died as a soldier, not as a criminal," while 8-year-old Edda, according to witnesses, seemed confused and asked if her father was now in heaven with the angels. The American authorities faced a decision about what to do with Hermann Göring's body, ultimately deciding to cremate it and scatter the ashes in secret, to prevent any grave from becoming a neo-Nazi shrine. But they also had to decide what to do with his widow and daughter, 2 people who had lived off stolen wealth, who had enjoyed luxury built on genocide, but who had not themselves been charged with any crimes, from riches to rags. And the denazification trials. After Hermann Göring's death on October 15, 1946, Emmy and Edda Göring faced a reality that would have been unimaginable just 18 months earlier. They had nothing. The vast Göring fortune, the stolen art worth tens of millions of dollars, the confiscated jewelry, the multiple estates, including the palatial Herrenhau, all of it was seized by the Allied authorities as stolen property, or tapped. Herrenhau itself had actually been destroyed by Göring's own orders in late April 1945, blown up by the SS to prevent it from falling intact into Soviet hands. But whatever remained was thoroughly looted by Soviet troops who arrived first. The Americans confiscated everything they could find in Göring's Bavarian residence, where the family had been captured, cataloguing over 1,500 pieces of artwork, countless pieces of jewelry, gold, cash in multiple currencies, and personal belongings of staggering value. Every single item was investigated to determine if it had been stolen from Jewish families, confiscated from occupied territories, or otherwise illegally obtained, and the vast majority had been. Emmy Göring was left with virtually nothing. Not even the clothes on her back were truly hers, as investigations revealed that even her wardrobe had been purchased with funds derived from confiscated Jewish property. But the Allies weren't done with Emmy Göring. She still had to face her own reckoning. Between 1946 and 1948, Emmy was subjected to the denazification process, a series of tribunals established by the Allied occupation authorities to determine the level of involvement and guilt of Germans who had participated in or benefited from the Nazi regime. These tribunals classified people into 5 categories: major offenders, offenders, lesser offenders, followers, and persons exonerated. Emmy's case was complicated because while she had never held an official Nazi Party position, never participated directly in crimes, and had no documented role in policy making, she had undeniably lived off stolen wealth and had been the public face of Nazi high society as Germany's unofficial First Lady. Her denazification trial began on March 15, 1948, in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, Bavaria, and the proceedings revealed a woman who remained utterly unrepentant and convinced of her husband's innocence despite all evidence to the contrary. When prosecutors presented evidence of jewelry she had worn, pieces confiscated from Jewish families who were subsequently murdered, Emmy claimed she had no knowledge of their origin and believed they were gifts or legitimate purchases. When confronted with photographs of herself at Karen Hall, surrounded by stolen art, she insisted that her husband had told her everything was acquired legally through proper channels. When asked about the concentration camps and the Holocaust, Emmy gave an answer that would define her public image for the rest of her life. "I knew there were camps for political prisoners, but I was told they were for re-education. I never knew about killings. My husband never told me such things." Historians and prosecutors alike found this claim dubious. How could the wife of the second most powerful Nazi, who lived at Karen Hall, where high-level meetings occurred, who socialized with all the top Nazi leadership, claim complete ignorance of the final solution? On June 21, 1948, the tribunal reached its verdict. Emmy Göring was classified as a follower rather than an offender, a relatively lenient classification. However, she was fined 30% of her assets, which was meaningless since she had no assets left, and was initially sentenced to 1 year in a labor camp. This sentence was significant because it acknowledged her complicity in the Nazi system while recognizing she had not directly participated in criminal acts. She was released from custody on September 7, 1948, after serving just over 3 years total, and immediately began a campaign to rehabilitate her husband's image. Emmy moved to a small Munich apartment with 10-year-old Edda. The mother and daughter lived in poverty by their former standards. A tiny apartment, no servants, surviving on a small pension, but Emmy refused to work and instead focused on writing her memoirs. In 1952, Emmy published her memoir, "And Their Side of My Manus, At the Side of My Husband," portraying Hermann as a brave soldier and victim of circumstances. The book was controversial, but sold reasonably well in post-war Germany, where many people were eager to believe the Nazi leadership had been deceived. Emmy raised Edda to believe her father was a hero who had been murdered by the Allies. Edda grew up in the 1950s, deeply conflicted, knowing that other children's parents whispered about her father, that teachers looked at her with pity and suspicion. She attended school in Munich under constant scrutiny, faced bullying from some classmates whose families had suffered under the Nazis, and received unwanted sympathy from others whose families remained Nazi sympathizers. Annie's response was not to help her daughter process the truth about her father's crimes, but to double down on the narrative that Hermann had been a great man destroyed by enemies. This pattern of denial would poison Edda's ability to form healthy relationships, build a normal life, or come to terms with her heritage. Edda's choice, a lifetime of defending the indefensible. As Edda Göring entered adulthood in the late 1950s and early 1960s, she faced choices that would define her life. Would she acknowledge her father's crimes? Would she change her name and disappear into anonymity? Would she speak honestly about the privilege she enjoyed while millions suffered? The answer to all these questions was a resounding no. On December 12, 1967, at age 29, Edda married German actor Hans-Ulrich Frank, and significantly, she insisted on keeping the name Göring, becoming Edda Göring Frank. This was not standard practice in 1960s Germany. It was a clear statement that she was embracing, not running from, her heritage. The marriage ended in divorce in 1972, and Edda never remarried, never had children, and spent the rest of her life living alone in Munich, dedicating herself to rehabilitating her father's image and denying or minimizing his role in Nazi atrocities. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Edda gave numerous interviews with consistently shocking statements. In a 1980 interview with Der Spiegel, when asked about her father's role in the Holocaust, Edda stated, "My father knew nothing about the extermination camps. He was a soldier, not a murderer." This is demonstrably false. Hermann Göring's signature on the July 31, 1941, authorization for the final solution is preserved in historical archives. Edda actively corresponded with Holocaust deniers and neo-Nazi groups throughout the 1980s and 1990s. In 1991, she stated, "The Holocaust has been greatly exaggerated for political purposes." Her mother, Emmy, died on June 8, 1973, at age 80, having spent her final years reinforcing these same narratives of denial. Throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s, as Germany grappled with its Nazi past, Edda became increasingly isolated, a symbol of willful historical amnesia. In 1999, filmmaker Chanok Zaevi interviewed Edda for a documentary. The footage shows her at 61, surrounded by photographs of her father in uniform, speaking lovingly about Karinhal, without mentioning where the wealth came from. "Do you acknowledge that your father signed the order authorizing the Holocaust?" Edda's response was, "I don't believe that document is genuine." In 2005, at age 67, Edda told the Daily Telegraph, "I loved my father very much, and I know he loved me. I'm proud to be Hermann Göring's daughter." When pressed about the genocide, her response was chilling. "Every war has casualties. Why is my father treated as uniquely evil?" The cousins who chose differently, and Edda's final years. While Edda spent her life defending her father, she wasn't Hermann Göring's only living relative, and the choices made by her extended family reveal that blood doesn't determine destiny. Hermann Göring had 4 siblings who survived to adulthood, and most significantly, Albert Göring, born March 9, 1895, just 2 years after Hermann. The brothers could not have been more different. While Hermann rose to become the second most powerful man in the Third Reich, Albert actively worked against the Nazi regime, using his brother's name to save hundreds, possibly thousands of Jews and political dissidents. Between 1933 and 1945, Albert forged his brother's signature on transit documents, demanded the release of prisoners, provided money and false papers to resistance groups, and personally drove supplies to help Jews hiding in Czechoslovakia and Austria. After the war, Albert was arrested because of his surname. Despite documentation of his rescue activities and survivor testimony, he was held until 1947 because authorities couldn't believe Hermann Göring's brother could have resisted the Nazis. When released, Albert found his reputation destroyed by association. No one would hire him, and he lived in poverty until his death on December 20, 1966. Albert's descendants made conscious decisions to distance themselves from the Göring name. Unlike Edda, who embraced a connection, Albert's children changed their surnames and avoided media attention. In a 2014 interview, one of Albert's descendants stated, "We don't celebrate the name Göring. We carry the burden of what Hermann did, but we're proud that Albert tried to fight against it from the inside. That's the legacy we choose to honor." This statement represents everything Edda refused to do: acknowledge the crimes, accept the burden of the past, and make a conscious choice about which legacy to perpetuate. Throughout the 2,150 years, Edda continued interviews with the same message: her father was innocent, misunderstood, unfairly convicted. In 2010, at age 72, she appeared in a German documentary, "I visit my father's memorial every year. Nothing anyone says will change my mind." When asked, "Do you believe 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust?" her response, 65 years after the war, "I think the numbers have been exaggerated." In 2012, at age 74, Edda said, "I choose to remember the father who played with me at Karinhal, not the man they claim killed millions." This statement encapsulates the fundamental problem. She believed that personal affection somehow transcended moral culpability, that being a loving father to one child somehow balanced authorizing the murder of millions. Edda Göring died on December 21, 2018, at age 80 in Munich, never having remarried, never having had children, spending her final decades alone. Her death received minimal media coverage, and she was buried in a private ceremony attended by fewer than a dozen people. Her burial location was kept secret to prevent her grave from becoming a neo-Nazi shrine. Edda left behind a will that donated her personal papers and photographs to a private collector known for sympathizing with Nazi historical revisionism. rather than to a legitimate historical archive. This final act was consistent with her lifelong mission to control the narrative about her father even after death. When news of this donation emerged in 2019, Jewish organizations expressed outrage, but German privacy laws protected Edda's right to distribute her estate as she wished. The final irony is that Edda, who spent 80 years defending her father and denying his crimes, will primarily be remembered not as a victim of her circumstances, but as an active participant in Holocaust denial and historical revisionism. Her life raises profound questions. What do children owe to the world when their parents commit monstrous crimes? At what point does loyalty to family become betrayal of moral truth? Can love for a parent coexist with acknowledgement of their evil? The Göring family story doesn't end with Edda's death, because there are other descendants living today in 2024, and most have made the opposite choice from Edda, changing their names, avoiding publicity, and acknowledging rather than denying the family's dark legacy. The contrast between Edda's path and that of her cousins demonstrates that inherited guilt is not destiny, that individuals can choose how to respond to their heritage, and that denial and acknowledgement are ultimately choices, not inevitabilities. The Göring family story proves that evil is not inherited through blood, but the choice to deny evil, to defend the indefensible, to prioritize family loyalty over moral truth, that choice belongs to each generation individually. Edda Göring spent 80 years choosing denial over truth, while her cousins chose acknowledgement over pride, reminding us that legacy is not what we're given, but what we choose to carry forward. In the end, we are not defined by the crimes of our fathers, but by our own willingness or refusal to face them honestly.